Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be representing the OAS and to share some of the good work of my colleagues from around the globe that have been working in peace and conflict resolution. And I see a number of colleagues and friends that are on here as attendees for the webinar, so welcome. Monica, I seem to be having trouble forwarding my presentation here.
Okay. Do you see the third tab in the top? You can select that third tab, and then you can change slides using the arrows located in the top menu. Let me know if it works.
Great, thank you. So we're going to, for this agenda, what we're going to talk about is conflict resolution education. I'm going to give you a brief overview about what that is. I'll give you an overview of what a comprehensive model looks like. A lot of the countries that I'm going to talk about and give you some examples are looking at this comprehensive model, some of these core pieces in their policies and legislation, and then we'll look at policy to practice. So I'll give you some of those examples from around the globe. So when I'm talking about conflict resolution education, I'm really talking about really a set of skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities that help model and teach in culturally meaningful ways, processes, practices, and skills that help individuals work through their own personal conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, and also institutional conflicts. So we're going to look at some of those skill sets. One of the key pieces, if you're doing this kind of work in schools, is to have a common vocabulary. And as I go through this presentation, I'm going to share with you some of the free resources available on the internet so you can all have access to some of these resources. One is the United States Institute of Peace's glossary of terms in conflict management and peace building. So later, as Monica mentioned, this PowerPoint will be posted on the OAS website. So then you'll be able to go back and click on these links and it will take you to those resources. When I worked for the Ohio Commission on Dispute Resolution and Conflict Management, so we had a state government agency in Ohio that worked with all of our public schools. We had about 3,600 public schools and 52 teacher training colleges and universities. When we were talking about conflict resolution skills, we're talking about understanding the nature of conflict, understanding how emotions influence conflict. So that's where you have your de-escalation skills, anger management, effective communication skills, so active listening, use of questions, verbal and nonverbal skills, your perceptions, perception taking, and problem solving. So this is just like in math, right? So we learn to add and subtract before we can multiply and divide. So it's really critical that if you're teaching these skills, whether it's to young people or if it's to teachers, parents, others working in the schools with youth, we need to teach these skills in this order. So you'll notice that these conflict resolution skills are really the basis for a lot of the conflict management processes like restorative justice, like mediation or arbitration, and other kinds of conflict management tools like sustained dialogue. The better you are at these core conflict resolution skills, the better you're going to be at those formal processes. So here's a model that we use here in Ohio in the United States for a comprehensive approach. But what you're going to see when I share with you some of the other countries, they too have done a more comprehensive approach like this as well, looking at student programming, curriculum integration, pedagogy, and school culture. So when we look at student conduct, I would actually change that to student programming. This was a model developed by Ellen Rader at Columbia University Teachers College and then adapted by Marina Piscolish. And you'll see that student programming there, those are some of the kinds of things like peer mediation programs. The curriculum is the curriculum integration, so ideally across subject areas. And we'll look at this more in depth here in a moment. Pedagogy is how we teach what we teach. So this is really modeling those skills in the classroom and everything from our classroom management practices to engaging with parents and the children and our fellow coworkers. And then school culture is that where we're working with parents. That's where if you have school bus drivers, you're going to be working with your school bus drivers, your administrative staff, but also that whole school programming for everyone that engages with youth so that you're modeling in appropriate ways, not only in our mission statements, but in how we do business. It becomes a way of how we operate as a school. So here are some examples. I'm going to go through those 4 key examples of a comprehensive approach, and then I'm going to give you examples from countries. Following that, we're going to have time for questions here. We'll take about an hour. So this comprehensive model, we have student programming examples like student ambassadors. Now, some of the schools use train young people, and if you're a new student in the school, it can be very difficult your first day of classes or your first week if you don't know anyone. So they have children who are trained to be basically their friends. Student ambassadors come and help those students who are new to the school and help them connect and build relationships with others. Bullying prevention programs, there's lots of curriculum out there. If you do a Google search for bullying prevention, you can find a lot of free resources, such as from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs, the U.S. Department of Education. Then we have peer mediation programs. Peer mediation programs, and I'm going to share with you in a moment some standards that are really critical for that, but peer mediation programs are where young people are trained to really facilitate as neutral third parties conflicts between their peers. And so there we need to, in order to do that well, there's the basic conflict management skills training, and in addition to that, there's the formal mediation process that the students are trained in. Then we have peace clubs. A lot of the schools have different kinds of, it could be, they might call them restorative justice clubs or peace clubs, where they do a number of different kinds of activities for the school and in the community, including a lot of times social justice projects or volunteer projects in the community. And then another neat tool that a number of schools do regarding student programming is playground monitors. So some schools actually put a bridge where students will go to the bridge of peace, where the students who are trained as mediators can either do a formal mediation or facilitate through the conflict for their peers there, which is a fun tool. So student programming example here of peer mediation, one of the keys that I want to share with you. In this 30 minutes, clearly we're not going to be able to teach you the skills of how to do these things. My goal was to give you an overview of some of the samples and connect you to resources. So hopefully in your locations where you are, you can find individuals who can do some of this training, or you can access this from the website. One of the things that I realized when I worked for our state of Ohio was the difference between quality of peer mediation programs. And part of that was based on those schools actually using these national standards for peer mediation programs. So this is one to take a look at. This includes what kinds of training that teachers should have, what kinds of training the students should have, and the number of hours. So let's think about this. Even as adults, if let's say you're trying to change a habit of how we react to something initially. And so let's say that we want to change some negative behavior. It takes us more than 3 hours to change our habits and our automatic reactions when we're in conflict to using other kinds of skills in general. So many times I would hear schools say, oh, I tried a peer mediation program, but it didn't work. And I say, okay, tell me a little bit more about what kinds of training the young people have. And they say, well, we did 2 hours with them and, they just couldn't do this. And we didn't get good results. And I'd say, okay, well, if we train even adults in 3 hours, you're not going to get great results. So I would say take a look at these recommended standards so you can get an idea of quality. So in the state of Ohio, we had about 1,200 public schools that had programs in peer mediation, conflict management. Those that had peer mediation programs that used these national standards, there was a difference of night and day in the quality. So here, one of the ways that we know to get the best results is to integrate conflict management skills across subject areas, so all students are receiving these skills. So we don't just want maybe children who have more challenges with their behavior, but all of us can benefit from learning these skills. So here are some ways Dr. Kathy Bickmore from the University of Toronto has a really nice form that she has written out that gives you some ideas of how some of these skills could be integrated into the curriculum. So you'll see there for language arts, speaking skills, listening skills, critical thinking, social studies. A lot of the countries integrate their conflict management skills into the social studies or history curriculum and language arts. Those are two of the easiest ways to integrate these skills. But also you can do it in the sciences and math, guidance, counseling, communication skills. In fact, a number of schools, their guidance counselors have extra sessions for those young people who may have additional challenges with their behavior so that they can learn and practice these skills so that they don't have a recurring problem in the classroom with their behavior. One of the things I want to share with you is there is a portfolio of promising experiences of policies, programs, and initiatives, the role of the arts and communication media in education for democratic citizenship. And that's from the OAS. So if you want to take a look there, there's the English document. I'm pretty sure it's also available in Spanish, so you could always Google that. But that is the link to the English version of that so that you can see how these kinds of concepts could be integrated into the arts. Here are some additional free curriculum resources. There's a lot out there, and one of the things that I shared with Monica is that I'm willing to put into a document that will also be posted up with this website and available online to it at any time, a more complete list of some of the resources out there. And by me sharing these aren't necessarily me endorsing these, but I wanted to share because they are free and available online. We know a number of individuals and organizations and countries that are using these tools. One is the UN Cyber School Bus. So if you go to that website, you'll be able to find a number of curriculum resources, everything from environmental education to human rights to peace education. Also, a lot of countries use literature. So think about the stories that are in your communities and how can you use those to teach appropriate ways of dealing with conflict and managing conflict. So I have worked with Help the Afghan Children with some of the work they're doing in Afghanistan. One of the tools that they use is literature. And so here you can access A Journey of Peace, Stories of Hope and Healing for Children Living in War. And this was put together by the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University in Canada in collaboration with Help the Afghan Children. It's available in multiple languages there. Also, the International Committee for the Red Cross. They have the Exploring Humanitarian Law curriculum. All of it's free. Excellent resources that you can integrate into your social studies. It's available in multiple languages, so hopefully you can access that. They also have videos, and they link to curriculum standards. The United States Institute of Peace has a peace building toolkit for educators. There's a high school edition and middle school edition. You can access it from this web link. And there's a brand new resource out from the Human Rights Education Association, a number of other organizations. In English and Spanish will be out soon for ages 10 to 14 around violence prevention. And that tool, a lot of times, the challenging behavior can be linked to alcohol or drug abuse. And so this is a violence prevention curriculum that's linked to helping to prevent alcohol abuse and violence. So that might be of interest to some of you. Now, so we've talked about student programming, we have looked at curriculum integration, and now we're moving into pedagogy. And this is one of the keys. So if you're looking at the best practices around the globe, we know that regardless of the quality curriculum that you have, if it's not implemented, the efficacy of the implementation is really critical for whether or not you're going to get those great results that you can get. So one of the keys that we know is pedagogy. We have to model the behavior in the classroom. So the better we are at modeling the behavior in the classroom, the more that the young people that are in our classrooms are going to be able to use those strategies. We'll see that in the classroom, and the better results we get. So here's some of the common things that you might see in a classroom. Writing classroom guidelines and rules. This is the first day of class. You're engaging the students. A lot of countries in the Americas connect their programs to democracy education. And so you might also want to have the students look at a student bill of rights. And so those are student bill of rights that will be used in the classroom and having them do a little research on what kinds of rights there are in their country and writing their classroom guidelines. I'll give you an example here in a moment. Also using daily, weekly class meetings or circle processes. So some people use the circle processes similar to restorative justice, but also there's the work of Jane Nelson in the United States, who's very popular for her positive discipline work around class meetings. Cooperative learning is really important. So the Montessori schools, if you have those in your countries, you're going to see a lot of work around cooperative learning. In the Montessori schools, they use those well. And then modeling, just generally modeling conflict resolution in the classroom. So if you're noticing a behavior that you're not pleased with, that we're able to model the conflict resolution skills with those young people. Here are a couple of resources they might want to use. We produced for our juvenile detention officers, so you can use it for any adults. The skills of conflict management are the same regardless of whether or not we're training adults to use these skills in the courts or with youth in the classroom. So here you can access communication and conflict management. That segment, it's a module, skills training, PowerPoints, and skill building activities if you're working with adults and want to train those skills. There's also a teacher engagement toolkit with some sample techniques to use in the classroom. So one of the great tools that's out there that you can access is from the International Committee for the Red Cross. And so here's the link to that. They have some sample teaching methods, especially if you're teaching conflict resolution. So it's not just about the curriculum, it's how we teach what we teach again. So these are some of the key things, different sample teaching methods that are used there. One of the things that I would encourage you to take a look at too is the no easy answers. So sometimes we as teachers, if we're talking about difficult issues that have happened in history in our own communities and our history books, that's a good methodology piece to take a look at. So how do we handle things? What if we don't know the answer? How will we respond to the students? Also, if you want to look at role playing. So a lot of schools use role playing. How do you use that well? What's the best practice for that? So sample classroom guidelines. Here you're going to see, this was something I mentioned that a lot of schools use at the start of the year. For the first week of classes, they use those throughout. The students, the democratic practices there of the students contributing and helping to form these classroom guidelines. But these are some of the samples. And these sample classroom guidelines also match with, of course, the school rules. So take turns speaking, one person at a time, raise your hand, listen while the other person is speaking. And this is a good classroom management tool. Here are some tips for writing them. So you include all students in the creation, use brainstorming. And that's a term we use here in the U.S., but a number of other places use it as well. And what we mean by that is allowing all to share ideas freely before they're evaluated, and then going back and evaluating. Will they work? And if not, why not? So determine some and discuss logical consequences too. They should be natural consequences. So for instance, if someone litters in the classroom, it doesn't mean that for the next week they must mop the floors all week, right? So maybe the first time that the student does that, they might need to pick up that trash, put it away, and be reminded of the rules. And then maybe the next time, the consequences might become greater. Post on the wall and keep them there for students as a visual reminder. So you remind students of those rules. Role plays, here's some examples. The purpose for role plays, a lot of people when they're using conflict management, they use role plays to see multiple perspectives, to practice their skills, but there's key ways to do these well. One is, a lot of times people don't do this, but you need to prepare them. So give them some clear instructions and give the observers a role. So that if you have a classroom of 30 students, those students should be the observers, right? While the other 5 students are up in the front of the class doing that. So maybe you have a checklist of what are the skills that the students are using, or questions, process questions students can be thinking about so they're engaged as well. You want them to rehearse and then perform it. And you want to make sure that you role play alternative endings and that you discuss which were some ways that they could do it, handle the conflicts non-violently. Always make it clear that students are role playing, that if they're playing a negative role, that they can practice the positive ways to address the conflict or issue. Here's an example of the class meetings where, again, this is a democratic process used in the classroom. They form a circle. They'll use sample guidelines like we did for the class meetings, like the classroom guidelines potentially here. They create an agenda, and so that might be if there's been a challenge in the classroom with behavior, that the students can discuss that and how do we prevent that from happening again and in the future. So what do we do about it now in the immediate moment and future planning, and that's really important. So finally, of the comprehensive approach with the whole school programming. So ideally, you want to have schools should be working with everyone that engages with youth, including the parents, the teachers, the administrators, and the bus drivers. Think about who engages with the students when, in many schools, if a student behaves negatively in the classroom, and if the teacher, for whatever reason, is not able to address that at that moment, where do they go? Well, many times the first person that they see will be the administrative assistant in the principal's office. Or so do we include them in how we train them, training them in conflict resolution skills so that they can de-escalate things that come to them. So we want to create a safe and supportive learning environment by modeling the skills and philosophies in our policies and practices. So some of the things that would be in that comprehensive model: professional development is key. We'll see that here when we look at some of the evaluation tools. Parent engagement programs, those are it's really important to attempt at least to have what we're modeling in the classroom to be modeled at home. So we want to include those parents. Then there's some whole school activities you can do, everything from peace weeks to many schools have peace gardens, creating student videos to share with the whole school. So these are some examples from schools here in the United States, but also some of the schools around the world and what they're doing for some whole school activities. These are by no means comprehensive. There are lots of other examples, but this is just to give you a start. Here are a couple of good resource tools I wanted to share with you. This guide, while it's older, is a great resource: Conflict Resolution Education, a guide to implementing programs in schools, youth serving organizations, and juvenile justice settings. It's free and downloadable from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs. Then we also have, this is something that I worked on with the National Association of School Psychologists and others, on managing and resolving conflicts effectively in schools and classrooms. So it's a 5-part free online course, and you can access that from that web page. One of the outstanding leaders in the field of evaluation here in the United States is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And so if you go to their website, you can find a lot of evaluations about curriculum and programs and best practices. Also, you can go to a collaborative website that I work on with Dr. Bill Warders. Dr. Tricia Jones had put together this website, and many funders, which you can access from the webpage there. But if you click on the For Researchers section, you can download all kinds of evaluation tools, evaluations of projects and programs from around the world. So moving into here in the next about 10 minutes before we take questions is policy into practice. So I wanted to share with you, in all of the world's regions, we have conflict resolution programs or related programs. So one of the things you're going to see when you take a look at some of the other countries is we may use different names for things. And there may be some subtle differences, but a lot of the core skills that I talked about earlier on conflict resolution education are incorporated in these. So in the United States, you're going to find a lot of legislation or policies around bullying prevention, democracy education, social emotional learning, violence prevention, safe schools. So if you go to the Education Commission of the States webpage, you can search by topic and find the legislation in the U.S. Globally, a lot, especially in the Americas through the Organization of American States, is really focused in funding democracy education programs, and peace education is frequently incorporated within that. In other countries, it's incorporated in the multicultural education, such as in Kyrgyzstan or in Australia. And you can click on the link there and do a search for some presentations that have been done at our international conferences on conflict resolution education by some of those countries, so you can read more in detail about what they're doing. So one of the things that we see a lot of around the world is integration into core standards. So what I mean is the curriculum standards maybe for the whole country, or for the region. So multicultural education, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan and Australia, that's where a lot of these concepts are housed. Democracy education, as I mentioned, in the Americas. Also for school psychologists and health educators here in the United States, if you look at the requirements for them, you're going to see a lot how this fits really well within health education and school psychology. Social studies and history, like in Kyrgyzstan in the United States, these concepts are integrated into, in the United States, how our standards are written are by state versus nationally. So our social studies in the United States, let's say in Ohio, these concepts are integrated within there. And one of the things that I'm not sure around the world if other countries have this, but here in Ohio, one of the curriculum standards that we have is the graduation reality and dual role skills. And these are standards, curriculum standards for our teen mothers. This was one of the curriculum standards that I worked on, where we integrated conflict resolution skills and strategies in different core areas. So I put the link there so you can download those and you can take a look at some samples of how those might be written. Also, health education, we talked about educational leadership. So that's how do we train our administrators and in language arts. So I already mentioned social studies standards. Here's an example of state integration in Ohio, where I'm from, and our grad standards, also school climate guidelines. So sometimes this isn't necessarily requirements, but these are recommended guidelines for a state or region. Frequently, of course, these kinds of strategies are integrated into the anti-harassment and bullying prevention legislation. And then here in the state of Ohio, we require school safety and violence prevention training for all educators, for all school personnel, K to 12. Again, it's only 4 hours, but it's a good start. So here's a link on our creeducation.org page where you can see various legislation from around the globe. So that takes you right to our global page. And one of the organizations that I represent and serve on advisory is the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. And it's an organization based out in The Hague in the Netherlands. And it is an organization made up of over 1,000 civil society organizations around the world doing work around peace building. And one of the core areas is peace education, and I serve on that advisory. I'm going to share with you what some of my colleagues in GPAC from around the world are doing in their countries. One of the things that we really try and focus on is bringing together governments, so ministries of education or ministries of local government, and the civil society organizations, or what we would call in the United States nonprofits, who are doing this work, and ideally researchers and other practitioners as well, educators too. So in Australia, I wanted to share that, and here are some good links. This was shared by Gary Shaw from the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Melbourne, Australia. And their new curriculum includes intercultural understanding. And again, like Kyrgyzstan, these kinds of concepts are integrated into multicultural education. One of the things that around the world we know we really need to focus on, again, is the professional development. And so here Gary's sharing that more professional development is needed, and I would say that's all over the world. We really need to focus more on quality professional development. And unfortunately, as occurs also in many other countries, racism is an ongoing issue, he shared. And so there's been a focus on interculturalism versus multiculturalism. And I think that's really interesting, that there's a key there beyond just awareness about the other, so knowing about another culture, but really interacting and engaging. And I know in Northern Ireland, with their work that they were doing in Education for Mutual Understanding, this was an issue too. You don't just bring people together, right? There needs to be meaningful interaction. So how do you create that? So you don't just learn about the different cultures, but you begin to build those important relationships. So here are some good resources, and I won't go over all these with you, but if you go to this webpage, these are some that Gary Shaw shared with me that are available from Australia on everything from their values education curriculum, civics and citizenship, to bullying and anti-racism curriculum. Philippines. So Philippines is really interesting. This was shared by my colleague at GPAC, Loretta Castro from Miriam College there, the Center for Peace Building. She works in teacher education. And what they're focusing on is the whole school approach. And so again, this is that comprehensive approach that I shared the model with you earlier. So we're looking at curriculum integration, student programming, including peace clubs, the school-wide. So are we using restorative discipline policies? So what are our policies look like for discipline? And in this case, they're using the restorative processes. Then pedagogy, so how we teach what we teach. And I know they've been focusing a great deal on trying to train teachers. And then the community, engaging the parents, and they're also doing service learning and advocacy in the community and having the young people go out there and that civic engagement piece. She has developed with a colleague this wonderful book that's available free and online on peace education, A Pathway to a Culture of Peace. We use it in our colleges and universities, but you could also use it with teachers. There's some good segments there on a whole school approach that you may want to take a look at. Here is an example, too, of national legislation, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to share with you the Philippines. This is one of the rare countries that I've seen where there's an actual executive order from the president to integrate peace education into basic education. And so this includes that it should be taught in service, so that's current teachers, but also teacher training institutions for our future teachers. It promotes peace ed in both public and private schools. So I think that's interesting as well, because many times the laws may only affect or impact or the policies of public institutions. So that's of interest. And then one of the challenges, though, all over the world, and this is not unique to the Philippines, so we have some great policies in practice, but then how do we build the infrastructure so that occurs, so that it gets implemented countrywide? And so one of the challenges that Loretta shared was that the implementation by the government isn't systematic, and that's many times challenges because of funding issues. So Miriam College has been helping to support this. Many civil society organizations help support those policies around peace education, and they've hosted 3 training workshops for educators, and including the Ministry of Education. So include those policymakers as well. Here's an example for Montenegro and Serbia. And I think this is unique because this is the first time that I've seen where there's been collaboration between 2 countries' ministries of education. And so they have a general law on education in Montenegro with a special emphasis on school mediation as an alternative dispute resolution tool. Well, what I think is really interesting is that back in 2009, there was a joint agreement signed between the Ministry of Education, between Montenegro and Serbia, which focused on including peace education and professional teacher training. It focused on, so again, this whole school approach, right, that we've been talking about, the curriculum and textbooks, but that included teacher education textbooks. And then the whole school approach, which included these kinds of peer mediation for the student programming, engaging parents. And one of the keys that I have yet to see in legislation that was unique to them is that there's education of the media in peace education. And can you think about if we were able to engage and train our media who report on conflict situations around peace education, how that can really impact what happens in our communities. This is a resource that they have. Unfortunately, it's only available in Serbian and Montenegrin at the moment. However, I wanted to just share with you that, look, that here again, they're doing the integration into the subject areas. Here they have math, language, so that's their the Serbian or Montenegrin or other languages in their communities, and then also in the English language. So, and then the arts and civic education. So that gives you some ideas. The Organization of American States, of course, has been doing a lot of work around the globe, and I'm going to wrap up here, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. But the Inter-American Program on Education for Democratic Values and Practices is an advisory that I have had the honor and privilege of working with. And I wanted to share some of the work that they've been funding in countries in the Americas. So here are my colleagues in Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and St. Lucia. They were working on a project to sustain a democratic culture in schools and local communities. And this is an interesting partnership. This was collaboration between Ministry of Local Government and Ministry of Education. And then our office has worked with them as well as other consultants that the OAS brought in to do training in conflict resolution. So one of the things that they were focused on was training teachers, youth, and local government staff in areas specific to the development of a democratic culture. So this included, and I thought this was wonderful, they were training local government as well as young people that would work with local government to help them come together to try and address the violence issues in their communities. So they were doing training in conflict management skills, student council, service learning, which goes beyond volunteering. And so I'd encourage you to take a little bit, maybe do a Google search on service learning versus volunteering to learn more about that. School climate issues, and then creating and sustaining student and municipal youth councils. So those youth councils are where they've trained the young people and the local government in conflict management skills and collaborative decision-making processes, which build on those conflict management skills, and looking at challenges in their communities so they can work together, the youth and the ministry. Here's the resource that I speak a lot about. I'm one of the collaborative members, but you'll see if you look at the partners and the sponsors button there, you can see a lot of good folks. Dr. Bill Waters was the original designer of this from Wayne State University, but you'll see the doors at the bottom. All of these are free resources you can click on based on what you're looking for, and I hope that you'll visit that web page. Lastly, before we take questions, I just want to mention that if there are any questions that arise, even after we're done here with your colleagues, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. You can send me an email, and I'm happy to help. A lot of colleagues from the OAS and GPAC come and present at our international conferences on conflict resolution education that are hosted, and the next one will be in 2014 in the Washington, D.C. area at George Mason University. One of the things that I want to share, though, is if you go to the Facebook page, even if you can't come, you can engage with the different speakers and ask them questions. So we have experts, policymakers, government. We also have practitioners and evaluators and researchers from more than 86 different organizations. So you can just ask them questions there on the Facebook page, even if you can't be there.
Thank you.